Chapter 1. The Midnight Intrusion. The wind howled through the open fields, carrying the familiar scent of hay, damp earth, and something unexpected, perfume. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped onto my porch, my flashlight flickering against the darkness. The barn door swayed on its hinges, creaking under the force of the wind. Something, or someone, was inside. I gripped the edge of the door, nudging it open cautiously. The beam of my flashlight swept across the wooden beams, illuminating a shadowy figure inside. At first, I thought it was a raccoon or a stray dog scavenging for food. But then came the unmistakable sound of a woman shrieking. "Close that light. You're blinding me." My stomach clenched. I knew that voice. Karen Monroe, my insufferable, lassoed-happy neighbor, stood in the middle of my barn, one hand on her hip, the other clutching her designer purse as if she had just stepped into a crime scene. Beside her, her tiny dog was happily tearing open a 50-pound sack of cattle feed, sending pellets scattering across the floor. My two barn cats lounged on a hay bale, watching the entire debacle like it was the best entertainment they'd seen all week. Karen was dressed in her usual impractical getup, an expensive blouse, spotless white slacks, and shoes that had no business being on a farm. She scowled at me as if I were the intruder here. "I knew it," she declared triumphantly. "You're running some kind of illegal operation in here. I have every right to check." I blinked at her, slowly processing the absurdity of what she had just said. "You have every right to check?" I echoed, incredulous. "On my private property?" Karen sniffed, brushing some imaginary dust off her sleeve. "Well, someone has to. Who knows what kind of filth you're keeping in here? I can already tell there are serious health violations." I cast a glance toward my two sleepy cows chewing cud in their stalls, completely unbothered by the unwanted visitor. My horse, Daisy, flicked her tail lazily, unimpressed. If anything, the only health hazard here was Karen's overpowering perfume, which was strong enough to knock a grown man unconscious. Before I could tell her to get the hell out, she pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures. "This is all evidence," she announced. "The town council will be hearing about this." That was it. I was done. With the smoothest motion, I stepped outside and yanked the heavy wooden door shut behind me. Click. The lock slid into place. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from inside, a muffled screech. "Hey, what are you doing? Let me out." I leaned against the barn, letting out a long, satisfied sigh. "Nah," I drawled. "I think I'll let the sheriff handle this one." The banging started immediately. "This is illegal. This is false imprisonment. I have rights." "So do I called back. "The right to protect my property. And the right to call the law on trespassers." There was a beat of silence. Then the dramatic gasp of someone who had never faced consequences in her life. "My dog is in here. He needs medical attention. You're endangering a small, defenseless animal." I glanced at the dog, which had now fully immersed itself in a pile of feed, tail wagging. Pretty sure it was living its best life. "You mean the one happily eating all my livestock feed?" I said. "Yeah, looks real endangered." The screaming continued, threats of lawsuits, wild accusations. At one point, she even tried to convince me she was conducting a citizen's inspection because she had received anonymous complaints about my farm. I doubted that, considering the only complaints ever came from her. Taking my sweet time, I dialed Sheriff Hank, explaining the situation in the calmest voice I could manage. "Yep, that's right. She's in the barn." "No, I didn't lure her in there. She walked in by herself." "No, she's not injured, except maybe her ego." As I spoke, the barn rattled from Karen kicking the door. "I know the mayor. I'll have your farm shut down. I'll have you arrested." Sheriff Hank chuckled on the other end. "Sit tight, John. I'll be there in 10. I crossed my arms and listened to the chaos inside. Something fell over, a bucket, maybe, followed by an even angrier shriek. "This place is a safety hazard. You're going to get sued into the ground." "I'll add that to the list," I muttered, amused. A few minutes later, Karen tried a different tactic. Her voice softened, suddenly dripping with fake sweetness. "John," she cooed as if she hadn't spent the last 15 minutes threatening my livelihood. "Let's be reasonable. This is all just a misunderstanding. I thought I saw something suspicious and, well, I accidentally stepped inside. You understand, right?" I smirked. "Sure. I understand that you're trespassing." There was a long pause. Then, very quietly, I think I might be having an asthma attack." I rolled my eyes. Karen, you've been screaming for 15 minutes straight. She huffed. Well, it's starting now. The flashing blue and red lights of the sheriff's truck appeared at the end of the driveway, cutting off any further nonsense. Sheriff Hank stepped out, thumbs hooked in his belt loops, taking one long look at the barn before shaking his head. You know, he mused, I always figured it'd come to this. I shrugged. She left me no choice. Hank knocked on the barn door, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. Ma'am, this is Sheriff Hank. I suggest you calm down before we add resisting to the list. The barn fell eerily silent. Then, after a moment, Karen's voice piped up, suddenly docile. Oh, Sheriff. Thank goodness you're here. You need to arrest this man. He locked me in here illegally. Hank shot me an unimpressed look. I simply raised an eyebrow. She walked in on her own. Karen let out a nervous chuckle. I was investigating. He's running an unsafe environment. I have evidence. Hank sighed, rubbing his temples. Ma'am, you're trespassing, and that means you're the one in trouble. The barn door creaked open, and Karen stumbled out, red-faced and covered in hay. Her dog trotted out behind her, tail wagging, belly full. Hank pulled out his notepad. Ma'am, I'm going to have to fine you for this. Karen gasped, clutching her chest like she'd just been sentenced to life in prison. You can't find. I was the victim here. Hank wasn't having it. You're lucky I don't take you in for trespassing. Now go home. As Karen stormed off, muttering about calling her lawyer, who didn't exist, I leaned against the barn door and let out a long, satisfied sigh. Deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Karen never backed down. And if she thought this humiliation was bad, she was about to learn the hard way that revenge doesn't always go as planned. Chapter 2. The Fallout. The morning after Karen's late-night barn invasion, I expected some form of retaliation. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. But instead of more threats or an official complaint, I woke up to an eerie silence. No banging on my fence. No shouting from across the property line. No HOA minions marching up my driveway. I stepped onto my porch with my coffee, scanning the horizon. Everything seemed normal. The cows were grazing, the chickens pecking at the dirt, and the barn door was still firmly shut. But I knew better than to assume she'd given up. Then my phone buzzed. A text from my buddy Rick, who ran the local hardware store. Might want to check Facebook. Your neighbor's at it again. I sighed and pulled up the town's community page. Sure enough, there it was, a long, all-caps rant from Karen, detailing how she had been falsely imprisoned by a dangerous, unhinged farmer. According to her, I had booby-trapped my barn, my animals were living in squalid, inhumane conditions, and my entire farm was a menace to the neighborhood. The post was filled with excessive punctuation and dramatic storytelling, clearly typed in the heat of her rage. But the comments? That was the best part. Instead of rallying behind her, most people were either laughing or calling her out. Wait, you went into his barn without permission? That's literally trespassing, lady. He locked you in? More like you locked yourself in. Booby traps. What is this, Home Alone, Farm Edition? I smirked as I scrolled through, watching Karen's plan backfire in real time. Even her usual HOA allies weren't defending her this time. People in town had put up with her antics for too long, and now they were finally seeing her for what she was. But I knew Karen wouldn't take this humiliation lightly. If she couldn't win people over with sympathy, she'd try something else. And that something else showed up later that afternoon. Chapter 3. Escalation. That afternoon, just as I was repairing part of the fence near the far edge of my property, I heard it, the unmistakable screech of Karen's SUV coming to a stop at the end of my driveway. I sighed, wiping my hands on my jeans, already bracing for whatever nonsense was about to unfold. Karen stepped out, phone in hand, her expression smug. She was dressed for drama, wearing oversized sunglasses and holding a clipboard like she was about to conduct an official inspection. Caught you, she declared triumphantly, holding up her phone. I crossed my arms. What now, Karen? She spun her phone around, revealing a shaky video of my fence. This is a clear violation. It proves your farm is unsafe. Your animals are escaping into the neighborhood. I raised an eyebrow. You mean the fence that you just cut? Her eyes widened in fake outrage. How dare you accuse me? I found it like this. It's my duty as a responsible citizen to report these things. I glanced at her purse. Sticking out of it, plain as day, was a pair of small pink-handled wire cutters, I pointed. Yeah? Then what's that? Karen yanked her purse behind her back like a guilty kid caught stealing cookies. That's none of your business. I shook my head, taking a deep breath to keep my patience intact. You do realize you're on camera, right? I gestured toward the security camera mounted on the barn, the one that had captured her entire little stunt in crystal clear detail. For the first time, she hesitated. Her eyes flickered toward the camera, then back to me. That footage is probably fake, she stammered. I pulled out my phone, tapped a few buttons, and brought up the live feed. There she was, clear as day, cutting the fence with her little wire cutters. I turned the screen toward her. Looks pretty real to me. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Then, instead of admitting defeat, she did what Karen always did, doubled down. That camera is an invasion of my privacy. I could sue you for recording me without my permission. I let out a laugh. Karen, you're on my property. You don't have privacy here. Her face turned an impressive shade of red. This isn't over, she shrieked before storming off, her tiny dog struggling to keep up with her furious pace. I watched her leave, shaking my head. This woman had no limits. Later that night, I sent the footage to Sheriff Hank. His response was quick. Don't even need to ask. I'll handle it. The next morning, I heard the sirens before I saw them. 2 sheriff's deputies pulled up in front of Karen's house, and within minutes, she was on her front porch, wildly gesturing and arguing as they handed her another citation, this time for property damage. She looked ready to explode. I half expected her to throw herself onto the ground and start rolling around in protest. I sat back on my porch with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the show. It was better than anything on TV. Chapter 5, The Last Straw. I thought Karen would back off after getting publicly called out. I was wrong. That night, I was locking up the barn when I heard rustling near the fence line. Instinctively, I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the noise. There she was. Karen, crouched in the dark, dressed in all black like she was on some kind of spy mission. Karen, I said flatly. What the hell are you doing? She gasped, whipping around with a guilty look before straightening her spine. I was checking for more safety violations. You can't intimidate me. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. You do realize I have cameras everywhere, right? She paled slightly. You can't just record people whenever you want. That's illegal. I turned my phone around to show the live feed. So, you breaking onto my property again is legal? She let out a frustrated huff. I'm doing the community a favor. Someone has to stand up to you. That was it. I was done playing nice. Karen, I said, my voice calm but firm. I've been patient. But this is trespassing. Again. And this time, I'm pressing charges. Her face drained of color. Why you wouldn't? Oh, I would. I pulled out my phone and started dialing Hank's number. In fact, let's call and find out. Karen panicked. Wait. No. You don't have to do that. We can talk. Let's be reasonable. I shook my head. Too late for that. Minutes later, Hank's cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing. Karen tried pleading her case, but Hank had heard it all before. Ma'am, he said, his patience worn thin. You're under arrest for trespassing. Again. Watching Karen being cuffed and placed into the back of the cruiser was the most satisfying thing I'd seen in weeks. As Hank shut the door, he glanced at me and tipped his hat. Maybe now she'll get the message. I smirked, crossing my arms. I won't hold my breath. As Karen's SUV sat abandoned in my driveway and her outraged shrieks faded into the distance, I finally felt something I hadn't in months, peace. For now, at least. Chapter 6, The Aftermath. Karen's arrest became the talk of the town. The community page was flooded with reactions ranging from pure schadenfreude to relief. Even those who had once defended her had gone silent. The people who had been fined, harassed, and dragged into her petty vendettas were now watching her finally face consequences. A week passed, and for the first time in what felt like forever, my farm was peaceful. No surprise visits, no false accusations, no fences mysteriously cut in the night. Sheriff Hank stopped by just to check in, shaking his head as he sipped his coffee on my porch. She's out on bail, but I doubt she's going to try anything for a while, he said. Her lawyer practically begged the judge for mercy, said she's dealing with emotional distress. I snorted. Emotional distress from what? Getting caught. Hank smirked. Something like that. But Karen wasn't done just yet. Chapter 7. The Final Blow. One morning, as I was heading into town for supplies, I noticed a for sale sign planted firmly in Karen's front yard. I blinked, not quite believing it at first. Could it really be? By the time I returned home, word had spread like wildfire. Rick called me up with the news. "She's leaving," he said, barely containing his laughter. Apparently, after her last court hearing, she decided she deserved a fresh start somewhere else. I leaned back in my chair, enjoying the irony. Yes, she finally figured out she wasn't running this place after all. The town's Facebook group exploded with speculation. Some believed she was forced out after her repeated legal troubles. Others thought she just couldn't handle the humiliation. Either way, the outcome was the same. Karen was packing up. A week later, I watched from my porch as a moving truck pulled into her driveway. She stomped around, barking orders at the movers, her usual self-important air somehow diminished by the fact that she was being forced to leave. As she loaded the last of her bags into her SUV, she turned to see me standing there. For a brief moment, we just stared at each other. Then, in classic Karen fashion, she scowled. "I hope you're happy. You've ruined everything." I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting her words hang in the air. Then, with a smirk, I simply said, "Didn't need my help for that." With an outraged huff, she climbed into her car and sped off, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of dust and a neighborhood that had never felt lighter. Epilogue. A new era. Karen's departure was a cause for celebration. Jim, my retired neighbor, threw a barbecue that weekend, and the entire neighborhood showed up. People laughed and ate, and for the first time in years, nobody was worried about surprise fines or unwarranted HOA complaints. "I can finally leave my trash bins out without feeling like a fugitive," someone joked. Rick raised a beer. To peace and quiet. And to never hear the words, "HOA violation" again. Everyone cheered. I stood back, watching as my neighbors relaxed and enjoyed themselves, knowing that the long battle was finally over. I wouldn't have to look over my shoulder anymore. Wouldn't have to brace myself for whatever ridiculous scheme Karen had cooked up next. For the first time in a long time, life on the farm was exactly as it should be, peaceful. And I intended to keep it that way.